Welcome to your daily dose of D, or not so daily dose of D. We're just gonna jump right on into it with Bob Kaufman, Heavy Water Blues. We are reading from the 60th anniversary edition of City Lights Pocket Poets Anthology, edited by Ferlinghetti. The radio is teaching my goldfish jujitsu. I am in love with a skin diver who sleeps underwater. My neighbors are drunken linguists, and I speak butterfly. Consolidated Edison is threatening to cut off my brain. The furball wants to go outside, only to be let back in again. Watch. The postman keeps putting sex in my mailbox. My mirror died, and can't tell if I still reflect. I put my eyes on a diet. My tears are gaining too much weight. I crossed the desert in a taxi cab only to be locked in a pyramid with the face of a dog on my breath. I went to a masquerade disguised as myself, not one of my friends recognized. I dreamed I went to John Mitchell's poetry party in my maiden form brain. Put the silver in the barbecue pit. The Chinese are attacking with nuclear restaurants. The radio is teaching my goldfish jujitsu. My old lady has taken up skin diving and sleeps underwater. I am hanging out with a drunken linguist who can speak butterfly and represents the caterpillar industry down in Washington, D.C. I never understand other people's desires or hopes until they coincide with my own. Then we clash. I have definite proof that the culture of the caveman disappeared due to his inability to produce one magazine that could be delivered by a kid on a bicycle. When reading all those thick books on the life of God, it should be noted that they were all written by men. It is perfectly all right to cast the first stone if you have some more in your pocket. Television, America's ultimate relief from the Indian disturbance. I hope that when machines finally take over, they won't build men that break down as soon as they're paid for. I shall refuse to go to the moon unless I'm inoculated against the dangers of indiscriminate love. After riding across the desert in a taxicab, he discovered himself locked in a pyramid with the face of a dog on his breath. The search for the end of the circle, constant occupation of squares. Why don't they stop throwing symbols? The air is cluttered enough with echoes. Just when I cleaned the manger for the wise men, the shrews from across the street showed up. The voice on the radio shouted, "Get up! Do something to someone." But me and my son laughed in our furnished room. Nice. It was strangely playful and pleasant. It has come to my attention through listening to myself that I slurp a lot. I like the sound of it. I find the feeling of it very satisfying. It's a great way to cool the tea and also enjoy the warmth. And soup, coffee. I slurp a lot of things. I slurp. But, yeah, that's me. Now I'm self-conscious about it, but I literally don't know how else to drink. Not literally, I figuratively don't know how else to drink, but feels very strange to drink a different way. Anyways, we are going to jump into some good old salt, fat, acid, and salt, fat, acid, heat by Samin Nosrat. Mastering the elements of good cooking. We are still into the wonderful world of fats, and I am not sure I think we did that one. So I think we are on rendering. Are you coming in? Yes? Thanks. Intermuscular and subcutaneous fats, the lumpy bits between the muscles and the layer of fat just beneath the skin, can be cut into small pieces, placed in a pan with a minimal amount of water, and rendered, or cooked over gentle heat until all the water has evaporated. This process transforms solid fat into a liquid that can be used as a cooking medium. The next time you roast a duck, trim all of its excess fat before cooking and render it. Strain it into a glass jar and store it in the fridge. It'll keep for up to 6 months. Save it to make chicken confit. Confit? Confit? Let's find out. Confit. 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 Like comfy, but confit. Chicken confit. While fat in meat is a great boon to flavor, it can also prevent meat from crisping. Even when the aim is not to render fat to use as a cooking medium, this technique is crucial for transforming texture. Crisp bacon is the happy result of properly rendered fat. Fry at too high a temperature, and it'll burn on the outside while remaining flabby. The key is to cook it slowly enough to allow the fat to render at the same rate the bacon browns. Since animal fats begin to burn at around 350 degrees Fahrenheit, try arranging sliced bacon in a single layer on a baking sheet and then slipping it into an oven set to that temperature. The heat of the oven will be gentler and more even than on the stove, giving the fat an opportunity to render. Or, when cooking bits of bacon or pancetta on the stove, start with a little water in the pan to help moderate the temperature. I really hope that is pancetta. And give the fat a chance to render before browning begins. The skin of a roast chicken or turkey will crisp up on its own, as long as the bird cooks long enough for the fat to render. Duck needs a little more help, though, since it has a thick layer of subcutaneous fat to provide the bird with energy for flying and help keep it warm in the winter months. Wow, I am highly reading these words incorrectly. Using a very sharp needle or metal skewer, prick the skin of the entire bird, focusing particularly on the fattiest parts, the breast and the thighs. The holes will allow the rendering fat to escape and coat the skin as it melts, leaving you with glassy, crisp skin. If roasting a whole duck is beyond your comfort zone right now, start with duck breasts. Before cooking, score the skin on both diagonals with a sharp paring knife, leaving behind a pattern of tiny diamonds. The same rendering will occur on a smaller scale, leaving the breast with perfectly crisped skin. I'm a stickler for rendering the fat cap on pork chops and rib steaks. I hate getting a nicely cooked steak with a strip of flabby, barely cooked fat running down the side. So either start or finish the cooking process by laying a chop or steak on its side in the pan or on the grill, allowing the fat to render. This might require a little bit of balancing trickery on your part. Hold the meat in place with your tongs, or try to cleverly lean the meat up against a carefully placed wooden spoon on the edge or the edge of the pan itself. Whatever you do, don't skip this step. You won't regret taking the time to turn that strip of fat into something golden, crisp, and delicious. Smoke points. The smoke point of a fat is the temperature at which it decomposes and transforms into a visible, noxious gas. Have you ever added oil into a hot pan for sautéing vegetables and then been distracted by a ringing phone? If you've returned to an offensive smoky scene at the stove, then the oil has surpassed its smoke point. Once, while I was trying to demonstrate the importance of preheating the pan to an intern, another cook approached me with an urgent question. By the time I addressed him and turned back to the pan, it was so aggressively hot that the second I added olive oil, it hit the smoke point, turning the pan black and throwing everyone nearby into a coughing fit. In an attempt to save face, I tried to imply that I'd made the mistake on purpose, and it had been a lesson about smoke points from the start. But, blushing hard before the other cooks, I couldn't keep a straight face, and we soon all dissolved into laughter. The higher fat smoke point, the further it can be heated without ruining the flavor of the food cooking in it. Pure refined vegetable oils such as grapeseed, canola, and peanut begin to smoke at around 400 degrees Fahrenheit, making them an ideal choice for high heat applications such as deep or stir frying. Impure fats don't do as well at extreme heats. The sediment in unfiltered olive oil and the milk solids in butter will begin to reach their smoke points or burn at about 350 degrees Fahrenheit, making them well suited for applications where a very high temperature isn't needed and their flavors can shine, such as oil poaching, simple vegetable sautés, pan frying fish or meat. Or use them for dishes that don't involve any heating, such as mayonnaise and vinaigrettes. Achieving crispness. Crispness results from food's contact with hot fat and water evaporating from the surface of food. So do everything in your power to keep the pan and the fat hot when seeking a golden crust. Preheat the pan, then preheat the fat. Avoid putting more than a single layer of food into the pan, which will cause the temperature to drop drastically and steam to condense and make food soggy. Delicate foods especially suffer in these instances. Cooking in fat that's insufficiently hot will cause food to absorb the oil, resulting, for example, in unappetizingly beige, greasy fish fillets, cooked through but not golden. Steaks and pork chops placed in cold fat will take so long to sear that by the time they appear to be perfectly cooked, the meat within will be well done, rather than medium rare. This doesn't mean you should categorically crank the heat. If the fat is too hot, the outer surface of the food will brown and become crisp before the center has a chance to cook through. Crisp onion rings with crunchy slivers of onion that slip out on first bite and chicken breast with burnt skin and a raw, flabby center both suffer from having been cooked at temperatures that were too high. The goal with all cooking is to achieve your desired result on the outside and inside of an ingredient at the same time. In this case, it's a crisp surface and a tender center. Add foods that take time to cook through, such as eggplant slices or chicken thighs, to hot fat, allowing a crust to form. Then, reduce the heat to prevent burning and allow them to cook all the way through. I'll explain more about how to navigate between different levels of heat in using heat. Once you have achieved crispness, do your best to retain it. Do not cover or pile up crisp foods while they are still hot. They will continue to release steam. The lid will entrap steam, which will condense and drip back onto the food, making it soggy. Wow, so sorry. Allow hot, crisp foods to cool off in a single layer to prevent this from happening. If you want to keep crisp foods such as fried chicken warm, set them in a warm spot in the kitchen, such as the back of the stove, until ready to serve. Alternatively, cool the chicken on a baking rack and then pop it into a hot oven for a few minutes to reheat it before serving. A People's Guide. We're gonna switch sides. I am stiff today. Been sitting a lot at work. It's been rough. A People's Guide to Capitalism by Hadas Thier. Chapter 2. The Labor Theory of Value. A commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious, trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that it is very strange. A commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious, trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that it is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theology and theological niceties. It is absolutely clear that, by his activity, man changes the forms of the materials of nature in such a way as to make them useful to him. The form of wood, for instance, is altered if a table is made out of it. Nevertheless, the table continues to be wood, an ordinary, sensuous thing. But as soon as it emerges as a commodity sold on the market, it changes into a thing which transcends sensuousness. It not only stands with its feet on the ground, but, in relation to all other commodities, it stands on its head. It evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas, far more wonderful than if it were to begin dancing of its own free will. Capital, Volume 1. The Cellular Structure of Capitalism. The opening line of Karl Marx's Capital is, "The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form." It may sound prescient of late-stage capitalism's hoarding disorders. But even in Marx's day, as capitalism was developing and growing in pockets of Western Europe, the world was already overflowing with commodities, goods for sale on the market. Marx began his study of capitalism by examining commodities, which he saw as its building blocks. In this chapter, we'll investigate these blocks, and through their examination, work through the Marxist understanding of value and the role of labor. At first glance, a commodity appears to be simple enough. We are surrounded daily by hundreds of thousands of commodities all about us. From the food that we buy at the grocery store, to knickknacks that clutter our apartments, to the apartments themselves, all these commodities and an infinite number more are bought and sold on the market. Simply put, a commodity is defined as something that was made through human labor, satisfies a demand, and is produced for the purpose of exchange. If I bake a loaf of bread to eat, then it's just bread. But if I bake it in order to sell it, then a loaf becomes a commodity. Production has existed throughout history. Human beings have always labored to make things, tools, food, clothing, shelter, in order to survive. Things manufactured, mined, or grown were not commodities, however, as long as they were made for direct use, rather than to be sold on the market. In hunter-gatherer societies, production was organized for use and consumption by the producers themselves. In feudal societies, peasants were the primary producers. They harvested crops for themselves, as well as a surplus product for the lord. In the current system, goods are not made for the personal consumption of the workers or bosses of a particular business. They are made for the purpose of exchange, that is, to be bought and sold. Workers at Apple don't come home with fistfuls of iPhones, nor did Steve Jobs live in a castle of iPads. Apple products are manufactured for sale on the market. The separation of production from consumption is unique to capitalism and was inconceivable in earlier times because needs were so immediate. A vast distance now exists between the maker and the user of a particular good. Each is anonymous to the other. As Marxist theorist Ernest Mandel wrote, "Someone who essentially produces in order to satisfy his own needs or those of his community lives by the products of his own labor. Production and products, labors and products of labor are identical for him, in practice as in his mind. In commodity production, this unity is broken. The producer of commodities no longer lives directly on the products of his own labor. On contrary, he can live only if gets rid of these products." By looking at who produces what and how it will be consumed, we begin the process of uncovering the structures of capitalism. It may seem like a tedious place to start, but it's where Marx begins Capital. He explains why in the preface. The value form, the value of commodities, whose fully developed shape is the money form, is very simple and slight in content. Nevertheless, the human mind has sought in vain for more than 2,000 years to get to the bottom of it, while on the other hand, there has been at least an approximation to a successful analysis of forms which are much richer in content and more complex. Why? Because the complete body is easier to study than its cells. But for bourgeois society, the commodity form of the product of labor, or value form of the commodity, is the economic cell form. To the superficial observer, the analysis of these forms seems to turn upon minutiae. It does in fact deal with minutiae, but so similarly does microscopic anatomy. The dual character of a commodity. If the defining aspect of commodities is that they are produced for exchange, we are immediately faced with a conundrum. How are they exchanged? What determines their values in relation to other commodities? Marx distinguished between two different kinds of values that we can attribute to goods: use values and exchange values. An item's use value is how it is used. The use value of bread is that it provides nourishment. The use value of a chair is that it can be sat upon, and so on. Regardless of whether that item is sold on a market, it still has a use value if it is useful to someone. All societies have thus produced use values, regardless of whether those items have been commodities to be exchanged. And even in our current capitalist system, some use values, like air, are still not commodities. A few expensive novelty jars of fresh air notwithstanding, capitalism has not figured out how to bottle up and sell us the air that we breathe. That has a footnote because that's a terrifying thought. Marx placed no judgment on what it means for something to be useful. He wrote, "The nature of these needs, whether they arise, for example, from the stomach or the imagination, makes no difference, nor does it matter how the thing satisfies man's need, whether directly as a means of subsistence, i.e. the object of consumption, or indirectly as a means of production, producing other commodities. At the end of the day, something has a use value if anyone has want or need for it, whether it is something as vital as bread, as destructive as drone bombers, or as trivial as your 1980s garbage pail kids and 1990s Beanie Baby collections." Some use values are universal. We all need air. We all need nourishment of some sort, whether it comes from rice, kale, or cookies. But other use values are geographically, culturally, and historically determined. Whether there is need or want for a product is not a fixed or evenly determined measurement. People living in the suburbs probably need a lawnmower, hedge clippers, and gardening tools, but someone living in an apartment in New York City is unlikely to have want or space for such items. The changing and often subjective utility of commodities is one of the reasons why it cannot be the determinant of how much something is worth on the market. See the sidebar, A Marginally Useless Theory, for more on mainstream economics concept of utility. Since a single commodity can often be more or less useful to different people, each person, the logic follows, would be willing to pay different amounts for a particular good. The muffins at your local coffee shop would have to be sold at varying prices based on the hunger level of each customer. Even accounting for average needs, or in cases where the hierarchy of utilities are more fixed, it makes no sense as a measure of exchange value. If it were, bread would be more expensive than cars, and certainly more so than diamonds. What then determines the relative value of goods? To answer this question, Marx distinguishes between an item's use value and its exchange value, the quantity with which one commodity exchanges for another commodity. Whereas use values are qualitative in nature, it matters a lot to me whether something is a chair or a loaf of bread before I sit on it. Exchange values are purely quantitative. How many loaves of bread make up a monetary equivalent of a single chair? Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin summed up Marx's approach this way: "A commodity is, in the first place, a thing that satisfies a human want. In the second place, it is a thing that can be exchanged for another thing. The utility of a thing makes it a use value. Exchange value is first of all the ratio, the proportion, in which a certain number of use values of one kind can be exchanged for a certain number of use values of another kind. Daily experience shows us that millions upon millions of such exchanges are constantly equating with one another in every kind of use value, even the most diverse and incomparable. These millions upon millions, now trillions upon trillions, of exchanges make up the daily life and breath of capitalism. The process of exchange of commodities is itself a historical condition. So long as trade between tribes or individuals was casual or episodic, there was no need to have clear measurements of relative values. But once regular networks of exchange and local markets took root, so too did the need for precise costs. As Marx explained, the exchange of commodities begins where communities have their boundaries, at their points of contact with other communities. However, as soon as products have become commodities in the external relations of a community, they also, by reaction, become so in the internal life of the community. Their quantitative exchange relation is at first determined purely by others, purely by chance. They become exchangeable through the mutual desire of their owners to alienate them. In the meantime, the need for others' objects of utility gradually establishes itself. The constant repetition of exchange makes it a normal social process. In the course of time, therefore, at least some part of the products must be produced, especially for the purpose of exchange. From that moment, the distinction between the usefulness of things for direct consumption and their usefulness in exchange becomes firmly established. Their use value becomes distinguished from their exchange value. On the other hand, the quantitative proportion in which the things are exchangeable becomes dependent on their production itself. Custom fixes their value at definite magnitudes. Capitalist society is organized around the quantitative exchange values of goods, rather than qualitative human need for use values. While you and I are primarily concerned with the use value of items, whether we can sit on a chair or on a loaf of bread, a capitalist does not care what an item's use is, so long as it will make him money. Use values only matter to capitalists insofar as they know they must produce something that can be sold, and useless things can't be sold. But what matters most is exchange value, how much money can be made from selling those goods. Put another way, the use value of grain and whether there are people that need to eat is not the system's main concern. Rather, its exchange value is what matters, whether and for how much grain can be exchanged. And so capitalism is responsible for such grotesque events as dumping grain reserves into the ocean rather than selling at a loss in order to feed hungry people. At the same time, boundless quantities of plastics and disposable everything are churned out without any regard for human and environmental consequences. The question of how exchange value is determined is, therefore, critical to understanding what makes capitalism tick. The common sense assumption in our society is that exchange value is somehow an innate characteristic of a product. An average car, for instance, is unquestioningly just worth about $30,000. Yet there is no physical manifestation of this value. You can inspect the materiality of a car all you like, but you won't see or feel or weigh the exchange value. So far, no chemist has ever discovered exchange value either in a pearl or in a diamond. Measuring physical qualities clearly does us no good in the realm of exchange. How do you compare a block of cheese with a bike? If we were trading hay for hay, that would be simple. We could put them on a scale against each other and determine an equal weight for a fair exchange. Of course, that would be a pointless exchange. It's the difference between use values that makes them exchangeable. And yet we obviously can't weigh a bushel of hay against a vat of soup to determine their rate of exchange. How then can two things that possess incommensurate qualities be compared or equated? The one property that all commodities have in common, and through which their value can be determined, is that each is a product of human labor. In Marx's words, despite their motley appearance, commodities have a common denominator. Commodities can exchange according to the relative amount of labor time that it takes to produce them. This basic idea is the core concept behind what's known as the labor theory of value, explained further below. But before turning our attention there, one final point about the dual nature of commodities, use values and exchange values. The difference, contradiction between, and unity of quality, use value, and quantity, value, is a recurring theme in Volume 1 of Capital. One type of value does not cause the other. How useful an item is does not determine its value on the market, nor does its value on the market determine how useful an item may be to us. Yet despite this lack of causality, the two values of a commodity impact each other and are inseparable. As Marxist economist David Harvey put it, the commodity, a singular concept, has two aspects, but you can't cut the commodity in half and say that's the exchange value and that's the use value. No, the commodity is a unity, but within that unity, there's a dual aspect. A thing can be a use value without having an exchange value. If you make a pie, it will be of use to you as you eat it, but unless you put it up for sale, it has no exchange value. At the same time, a thing cannot have an exchange value if it does not have a use value. If you make a bunch of foul, inedible pies for sale at the local market, and if no one has use for foul, inedible pies, then these pies will also have no exchange value, no matter how long it took you to make them. The item doesn't have to be useful to the person or people who produced them, but they have to be useful to someone in order to have an exchange value. And that's the purpose of having a market, to find a buyer who will have use for what you've created. In fact, it's precisely the fact that an item has no use value to its producer that allows it to be an exchange value. If a tailor sews a coat to wear, she can't very well sell it to someone else at the same time. An item that has a use value to the tailor can't simultaneously have an exchange value for sale. But if she makes 2 coats and can realistically only wear one, the fact that the second coat is redundant and therefore has no use value to the tailor is exactly what gives it the potential to be an exchange value. Simply put, you can either live in your house or you can sell your house. You can't have your cake and eat it too. And that's where we're going to pause. All right. Slippery. All right. We are reading from The Ultimate Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. And we are reading The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, also by Douglas Adams. We are in chapter 12. A loud clatter of gunk music flooded through the heart of Gold Cabin as Zaphod searched the sub-ether radio wave bands for news of himself. The machine was rather difficult to operate. For years, radios had been operated by means of pressing buttons and turning dials. Then, as the technology became more sophisticated, the controls were made touch-sensitive. You merely had to brush the panels with your fingers. Now all you had to do was wave your hand in the general direction of the components and hope. It saved a lot on muscular expenditure, of course, but meant that you had to sit infuriatingly still if you wanted to keep listening to the same program. Zaphod waved a hand and the channel switched again. More gunk music, but this time it was a background to a news announcement. The news was always heavily edited to fit the rhythms of the music. And news reports brought to you here on the sub-ether wave band, broadcasting around the galaxy around the clock, squawked a voice, and we'll be saying a big hello to all intelligent life forms everywhere, and to everyone else out there. The secret is to bang the rocks together, guys. And of course, the big news story tonight is a sensational theft of the new Improbability Drive, prototype ship by none other than Galactic President Zaphod Beeblebrox. And the questions everyone asking is, has the big Z finally flipped? Beeblebrox, the man who invented the Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster, ex-confidence trickster, once described by Eccentrica Galambits as the best bang since the Big One, and recently voted the worst-dressed sentient being in the known universe for the 7th time. Has he got an answer this time? We asked his private brain care specialist Gag Halfrit. The music swirled and died for a moment. Another voice broke in, presumably Halfrit. He said, well, Zaphod's just this guy, you know? But got no further because an electric pencil flew across the cabin and through the radio's on-off sensitive airspace. Zaphod turned and glared at Trillian. She had thrown the pencil. Hey, he said, what did you do that for? Trillian was tapping her fingers on a screen full of figures. I've just thought of something, she said. Yeah? Worth interrupting a news bulletin about me for? You hear enough about yourself as it is. I'm very insecure. We know that. Can we drop your ego for a moment? This is important. If there's anything more important than my ego around, I want it caught and shot now. Zaphod glared at her again, then laughed. Listen, she said, we picked up those couple of guys. What couple of guys? The couple of guys we picked up. Oh yeah, said Zaphod, those couple of guys. We picked them up in Sector Delta Z, plural Z Alpha. Delta Z, double Z. Yeah, said Zaphod, and blinked. Trillian said quietly, Does that mean anything to you? Said Zaphod. ZZ, double Z, plural Z alpha, double Z, plural Z alpha. Well, said Trillian. What does the Z mean? Which one? Any one. One of the major difficulties Trillian experienced in her relationship with Zaphod was learning to distinguish between him pretending to be stupid just to get people off their guard, pretending to be stupid because he couldn't be bothered to think and wanted someone else to do it for him, pretending to be outrageously stupid to hide the fact that he actually didn't understand what was going on, and really being genuinely stupid. He was renowned for being amazingly clever, and quite clearly was so, but not all the time, which obviously worried him, hence the act. He preferred people to be puzzled rather than contemptuous. This, above all, appeared to Trillian to be genuinely stupid, but she could no longer be bothered to argue about it. She sighed and punched up a star map on the Visi screen so she could make it simple for him, whatever his reasons for wanting it to be that way. There, she pointed, right there. Hey, yeah, said Zaphod. Well, she said, well, what? Parts of the inside of her head screamed at other parts of the inside of her head. She said, fairly calmly, it's the same sector you originally picked me up in. He looked at her and looked back at the screen. Hey, yeah, he said. Now that is wild. We should have zapped straight into the middle of the Horsehead Nebula. How did we come to be there? I mean, that's nowhere. She ignored this. Improbability drive, she said patiently. You explained it to me yourself. We pass through every point in the universe. You know that. Yeah, but that's one wild coincidence, isn't it? Yes. Picking someone up at that point, out of the whole of the universe to choose from, that's just too... I want to work this out. Computer? The Sirius Cybernetics shipboard computer, which controlled and permeated every particle of the ship, switched into communication mode. Hi there, it said brightly, and simultaneously spewed out a tiny ribbon of ticker tape just for the record. The ticker tape said, Hi there. Oh, God, said Zaphod. He hadn't worked with his computer for a long... But he had already learned to loathe it. The computer continued, brash and cheery as if it were selling detergent. I want you to know that whatever your problem, I am here to help you solve it. Yeah, said Zaphod. Look, I think I'll just use the piece of paper. Sure thing, said the computer, spilling out its message into a waste bin at the same time. I understand. If you ever want, shut up, said Zaphod, and snatching up a pencil, sat down next to Trillian at the console. Okay, said the computer in a hurt tone of voice and closed down its speech channel again. Zaphod and Trillian pored over the figures of the improbability flight path scanner flashed silently up in front of them. Can we work out, said Zaphod, from their point of view, what the improbability of their rescue was? Yes, that's a constant. 2 to the power of 276,709 to 1 against. That's high. They're 2 lucky guys. Yes. But relative to what we were doing when the ship picked them up. Trillian punched up the figures. They showed 2 to the power of infinity minus 1 to 1 against, an irrational number that only has a conventional meaning in improbability physics. It's pretty low, continued Zaphod with a slight whistle. Yes, agreed Trillian, and looked at him quizzically. That's one big whack of improbability to be accounted for. Something pretty improbable has got to show up on the balance sheet if it's all going to add up into a pretty sum. Zaphod scribbled a few sums, crossed them out, and threw the pencil away. Bats dues, I can't work it out. Well? Zaphod knocked his 2 heads together in irritation and gritted his teeth. Okay, he said. Computer? The voice circuit sprang to life again. Why, hello there, they said. Ticker tape, ticker tape. All I want to do is make your day nicer and nicer and nicer. Yeah, well, shut up and work something out for me. Sure thing, chattered the computer. You want a probability forecast based on improbability data? Yeah. Okay, the computer continued. Here's an interesting little notion. Did you realize that most people's lives are governed by telephone numbers? A pained look crawled across one of Zaphod's faces and onto the other one. Have you flipped, he said. No, but you will when I tell you that, Trillian gasped. She scrambled at the buttons and the improbability flight path screen. Telephone number. She said, did that thing say telephone number? Numbers flashed up on the screen. The computer has paused politely, but now it continued. What I was about to say was that, don't bother, please, said Trillian. Look, what is this? Said Zaphod. I don't know, said Trillian, but those aliens, they're on the way up to the bridge with that wretched robot. Can we pick them up on any monitor cameras? Alright, chapter 13. Marvin trudged on down the corridor, still moaning. And then, of course, I've got this terrible pain in all the diodes down my left-hand side. No, said Arthur grimly as he walked along beside him. There we go. Really? Oh, yes, said Marvin. I mean, I've asked for them to be replaced, but no one ever listens. I can imagine. Vague whistling and humming noises were coming from Ford. Well, he kept saying to himself. Zaphod Beeblebrox. Suddenly Marvin stopped, held up a hand. You know what's happened now, of course. No, what? Said Arthur, who didn't want to know. We've arrived at another one of those doors. There's a sliding door let into the side of a corridor. Marvin eyed it suspiciously. Well, said Ford impatiently, do we go through? Do we go through, mimicked Marvin? Yes, this is the entrance to the bridge. I was told to take you to the bridge. Probably the highest demand that will be made on my intellectual capacities today, I shouldn't wonder. Slowly, with great loathing, he stepped towards the door, like a hunter stalking his prey. Suddenly, it slid open. Thank you, it said, for making a simple door very happy. Deep in Marvin's thorax, gears ground. Funny, he intoned funerally, how just when you think life can't possibly get any worse, it suddenly does. He heaved himself through the door and left Ford and Arthur staring at each other and shrugging their shoulders. From inside they heard Marvin's voice again. I suppose you'll want to see the aliens now, he said. Do you want me to sit in a corner and rust, or just fall apart where I'm standing? Yeah, just show them in, would you, Marvin? Came another voice. Arthur looked at Ford and was astonished to see him laughing. What? Shh, said Ford. Come on in. He stepped through into the bridge. Arthur followed him in nervously and was astonished to see a man lolling in a chair, with his feet on a control console, picking the teeth in his right hand with his left hand. The right hand head seemed to be thoroughly preoccupied with this task, but the left-hand one was grinning a broad, relaxed, nonchalant grin. The number of things that Arthur couldn't believe he was seeing was fairly large. His jaw flopped about at a loose end for a while. The peculiar man waved a lazy hand at Ford, and with an appalling affectation. The peculiar man waved a lazy wave at Ford, and with an appalling affectation of nonchalance said, Ford, hi, how are you? Glad you could drop in. Ford was not going to be outcooled. Zaphod, he drawled. Great to see you. You're looking well. The extra arm suits you. Nice ship you've stolen. Arthur goggled at him. You mean you know this guy? He said, waving a wild finger at Zaphod. Know him, exclaimed Ford. He paused and decided to do the introductions the other way around. On Zaphod, this is a friend of mine, Arthur Dent, he said. I saved him when his planet blew up. Oh, sure, said Zaphod. Hi, Arthur. Glad you could make it. His right hand looked around casually, said hi, and went back to having its teeth picked. Ford carried on, and Arthur, this is my semi-cousin Zaphod we've met, said Arthur sharply. When you're cruising down the road in the fast lane and you lazily sail past a few hard-driving cars and are feeling pretty pleased with yourself and then accidentally change down from fourth to first instead of third, thus making your engine leap out of your hood in rather ugly mess, it tends to throw you off your stride in much the same way that this remark threw Ford Prefect off his. What? He said. I said we've met. Zaphod gave an awkward start of surprise and jabbed a gum sharply. Have we? Ford rounded on Arthur with an angry flash in his eyes. Now he felt he was back on home ground. He suddenly began to resent having lumbered himself with this ignorant primitive who knew as much about the affairs of the galaxy as an Ilford-based gnat he knew about life in Peking. What do you mean you've met? He demanded. This is Zaphod Beeblebrox from Betelgeuse 5, you know, not bloody Martin Smith from Croydon. I don't care, said Arthur coldly. We've met, haven't we, Zaphod Beeblebrox? Or should I say, Phil? What? Shouted Ford. You'll have to remind me, said Zaphod. I have a terrible memory for species. It was at a party, pursued Arthur. Yeah, well, I doubt that. Cool it, will you, Arthur? Demanded Ford. Arthur would not be deterred. A party 6 months ago, on Earth, England. Zaphod shook his head with a tight-lipped smile. London, insisted Arthur. Islington? Oh, said Zaphod with a guilty start. That party. This wasn't fair on Ford at all. He looked backward and forward between Arthur and Zaphod. What? He said to Zaphod. You don't mean to say that you've been on that miserable little planet as well, do you? No, of course not, said Zaphod breezily. Well, I may have just dropped in briefly, on my way somewhere. But I was stuck there for 15 years. Well, I didn't know that, did I? But what were you doing there? Looking about, He gate crashed a party, said Arthur, trembling with anger. A fancy dress party. It would have to be, wouldn't it? Said Ford. At this party, persisted Arthur, was a girl. Oh, well, look, it doesn't matter now. The whole place has gone up in smoke anyway. I wish you'd stop sulking about that bloody planet, said Ford. Who was the lady? Oh, just somebody. Well, all right. I wasn't doing very well with her. I'd been trying all evening. Hell, she was something, though. Beautiful, charming, devastatingly intelligent. At last I'd gotten her to myself for a bit. And was plying her with a bit of talk when this friend of yours barges up and says, Hey, doll, is this guy boring you? Why don't you talk to me instead? I'm from a different planet. I never saw her again. Zaphod, exclaimed Ford. Yes, said Arthur, glaring at him and trying not to feel foolish. He only had 2 arms and the one head, and he called himself Phil, but you must admit he did turn out to be from another planet, said Trillian, wandering into sight at the other end of the bridge. She gave Arthur a pleasant smile which settled on him like a ton of bricks, and then turned her attention to the ship's controls again. There was a silence for a few seconds, and then out of the scrambled mess of Arthur's brain crawled some words. Trisha McMillan, he said. What are you doing here? Same as you, she said. I hitched a lift. After all, with a degree in math and another in astrophysics, what else was there to do? It was either that or the dole queue again on Monday. Infinity minus 1, chattered the computer. Improbability sum now complete. Zaphod looked at him. Zaphod looked about him, at Ford, at Arthur, and then at Trillian. Trillian, he said, is this sort of thing going to happen every time we use the improbability drive? Very probably, I'm afraid, she said. And that is where we're going to end with one more poem. From Allen Ginsberg that said, this form of life needs sex. I will have to accept women if I want to continue the race. Kiss breasts, accept strange hairy lips behind buttocks. Look in what the... Yeah, we're doing it. Allen Ginsberg, this form of life needs sex. I will have to accept women if I want to continue the race. Kiss breasts, accept strange hairy lips behind buttocks. Look in questioning womanly eyes, answer soft cheeks, bury my loins in the hang of pear plum, fat tissue I had abhorred. Before I gave God's spasm, babe, leap forward through death. Between me and oblivion, an unknown woman stands, not the muse, but living meat phantom, a mystery scary as my fanged God, sinking its foot in its gullet and vomiting its own image out of its ass. This woman futurity I am pledged to born, not to die, but issue my own cock-brain replica me-hood again, for fear of the blot face of death, my female, as I'm sainted, to my very bone. I'm fated to find me a maiden for ignorant fuckery. Flapping my belly and smeared with saliva, shamed face, flesh and wet, have long droopy conversations in cosmical duty boudoirs, maybe bored? Or excited new prospect, discuss her futurity, my wife, my mother, death, my only hope, my very resurrection, woman, herself. Why have I feared to be joined true, embraced beneath the panties of forever, with the one hole that repelled me 1937 on? Pulled down my pants on the porch, showing my behind to cars passing in rain, and she be interested, this contact with silly new male, that sucked my love man's cock in adoration and sheer beggary, romance all, gulp, choke, hope of life come, and buggered myself innumerably innumerably boy-yangs, gloamed inward so my solar plexus feel Godhead in me like an open door. Now that's changed my decades body old, though admiring male thighs at my brow, hard love pulsing through my ears, stern buttocks upraised for my masterful. It says rape, and that's fucked. That were meant for a private shit. If the army were all, but no more answer to life than the muscular statue I felt up its marbles, envying beauty's immortality in the museum of yore. You can fuck a statue, but you can't have children. You can join man to man, but the sperm comes back in a trickle at dawn, in a toilet on the 45th floor, and can't make continuous mystery out of that finished performance and ghastly thrill that ends as began. Stupid reptile squeak, denied life by fairy creator, become imaginary. Because he decided not to incarnate, opposite old spook who didn't want to be a baby and die, didn't want to shit and scream, exposed to bombardment on a Chinese railroad track, and grow up to pass his spasm on the other half of the universe, like a homosexual capitalist afraid of the masses. And that's my situation, folks. New York, April 12, 1961. That was fascinating. Appreciate y'all as always. Catch you on the flip side.